Hi everyone, and happy Wednesday. This week I'm working on a textured abstract, and I was inspired to create this painting by the simple fact of the matter that I was in the mood to experiment and play with some of my supplies that I have not yet used with watercolors. So I'm trying something that I have worked with before using acrylic paints, but I've never done it with watercolors, and so I'm not 100% sure how it's gonna go. But I think it has a chance of being something really fun to work with watercolors as well. So I'm gonna be using a product called Crackle Paste. And I'm hoping that because it has a bit of a grittiness to it when it dries, that it will let the watercolors adhere to it. I will also, of course, be using some watercolor ground to create some of my textures, and I will be using some collage elements as well. I have some papers that have really neat textures to them that I'm gonna adhere to my cradle board. And I'm just wanting to play and have fun. So that's the whole purpose of this project, is for me to experiment, to let loose and explore possibilities. I want to take a moment to say a very big, sincere thank you for making the time to visit my website. I've had such a wonderful response to going live. I've sold so many paintings, which is really exciting. It's really neat for me to know that my paintings have found some new loving homes. And I'm excited for what lies ahead. With the year 2025 on the horizon, I am really hoping to have some classes available to you on my website. And I'm not yet sure exactly 100% for sure what those classes are going to look like, but I would like to hear from you. If there is something in particular that you would love to learn, I would love to consider it for one of my classes. So please don't hesitate to pass your suggestions along. And as usual, thank you, thank you, thank you so much for being here and for connecting with me every week. It is such a gift, and my channel would really not be the same without you. So from the bottom of my heart, a huge thank you for being here with me. Let's get going with my process for this week. I'll be working on a piece of cradle board for this project. And so I've adhered some watercolor paper to the same measurements as the board itself. And I stuck my paper on the board using some modeling paste. Modeling paste is, of course, not the only thing you can use to adhere your collage elements to a project like this. I think it's always a great idea to shop our stash and see what we have on hand and use that. I happen to have a lot of modeling paste on hand. I find it very light and easy to work with, and so I want to use it for this project. Um, but again, if that's not what you have on hand, please feel free to use whatever works for you. One thing to keep in mind about the paper that I'm using right now, of course, is that it is very neutral in color, and if I add watercolor to it, it probably would adhere, but the watercolors would come out darker than I actually want them to. So once I'm done adhering all of these collage elements to my board, I will also use some watercolor ground to cover those elements so that they can take the watercolor um, while preserving some of the watercolor's color qualities. The medium I'm working with right now is the crackle paste, and it's a medium that tends to work best when it's applied relatively thickly. The thinner your layers, the less cracks will form. The thicker your layers, the more cracks will form. So it's one thing to keep in mind when you're using this product is to apply it rather generously, depending on, again, how much you want cracks to form. So already the crackle paste has dried, and you can see on the left-hand side that a lot of cracks have formed in the areas where the paste was applied more thickly. So now I'm just using some of my watercolor ground along with a stencil to add a few more textural elements and I guess design elements to my painting before I move on to adding color. My very first layer of color is usually very uniform, and it's usually also a very light wash. I want to be able to start picking up on some of the textures that are in the background of the painting and sort of have them call out to me so that I can figure out what I want to do next. Because everything is white for the most part on the board, it's harder to see those textures and all of the different sort of um, elements that have been created with the use of the textures. And so using a light wash of color, the textures start to come out more, and I start to get some little intuitive nudges for what I can potentially accomplish next. One thing I'm noticing already this early in the process is that the watercolors do not tend to want to adhere to the crackle paste as much as they do to watercolor ground. And so one thing I could have done to remedy this before I continued on is actually use the watercolor ground to sort of paint a little bit of it on top of the crackle paste, being careful not to completely cover the cracks. So it would have probably been best to maybe dilute the watercolor ground before adding it to the crackle paste. But I decided not to do this. I'm going to keep working, adding colors, different layers of colors. And as I go along, I'm hoping that the watercolor will start to adhere more to the crackle paste. And I'll just keep adding and adding and adding. In the end, I think it will be ideal, and I consider it ideal to do this regardless of whether or not I'm working with crackle paste or if I'm just working with regular watercolor ground. It's going to be ideal for a painting like this one to add a fixative to make sure everything, the integrity of the painting remains intact. And adding a fixative over everything, even if the watercolor is not adhering to the crackle paste as much as I would like it to, the fixative will make it do that. So I'm not gonna worry about going back and adding watercolor ground after having started to add my color. This is just something to maybe experiment with in the future to see if adding a little layer, a light wash of watercolor ground over the crackle paste would make the watercolors adhere better to them. But again, I'm not overly worried about it. I'm just going to keep adding my colors, and because I'm working with multiple layers of color, I think in the end my colors will remain bright, and I'll finish the whole piece off with a fixative that will protect the integrity of the painting. As I'm working on developing the color scheme for my painting, I often will get nudges. Initially, I was thinking I would only add some blue to the areas that I started off with. And as I kept working, it felt like I needed to add more. And that was just my intuition kicking in and saying it would look better for me visually, that I would find the painting more visually appealing if I added a little bit more blue and broke some of those warm colors down a little bit. I love the juxtaposition of the warm colors next to the cooler blues, and I think that contrast is really helping the painting come together. And so that's why I think adding more of this blue into the painting will help bring everything together more cohesively.
As I'm continuing to work to add more color over the areas where I have the crackle paste, I'm discovering that it's better if I do not scrub my brush over these areas too much, because what happens is the watercolor, of course, can lift. It's not adhering to the crackle paste as much as I would have liked it to. But if I keep my brush strokes very light and gentle, the color can stay intact. And then for my final layers, what I'll do is I'll probably wet the areas and just gently drop in some color. And as I was saying again earlier, it will in the end be covered with a fixative, so I'm not worried that the watercolor will come off the painting later on because it will be affixed to the painting using a fixative. But I don't want to scrub it off as I'm adding more paint to it. It would kind of defeat the purpose. So, so I'm trying to be gentle. I do wonder again if adding some watercolor ground, a light wash of the watercolor ground over the areas where I have the crackle paste, if that could have helped. But again, it would have been very important not to go too heavy on the watercolor ground. Otherwise, it would have just filled the cracks and I would have not been able to keep those lovely textures that I wanted to create with the crackle paste to begin with. Now that I'm feeling satisfied with the saturation of my colors on the painting, I'm going to start adding some lighter colors to the mix so that I can add a little bit more contrast. In this case, I think the star of the show, my focal point, is calling for some star gold. So I'm gonna add it in. Yes, yes, yes. Look at it when it's coming up. When it's being added over these textures with the dark paint just below it, it just makes that element of the painting stand out even more. And so it was the perfect place for me to add that star gold. And I think I'll also add it to some of those little squares and maybe just a little tiny bit of like a dusting of this gold in other areas of the painting, but just very lightly. For me, the best way to make a painting such as this one on a piece of Gradle board or on a canvas feel finished is to make sure that the sides are also painted. Otherwise, it seems like something is missing. And then, of course, to finish things off and make sure all of my elements are protected, I'm also going to add a fixative spray. And this is the kind of spray I like to use. I have two different ones and they work very well. I like to use a gloss for a painting such as this one, especially because I use iridescent paints and I want to make sure that they continue to keep their shimmer. Another reason to use a gloss finish on a painting like this one is that it gives the paints a little bit of a wet look. And when the paints are wet, they tend to look more vibrant than when they are dry, especially with watercolors. So I find a gloss finish works really well on on a painting like this one, and it helps to make the whole look more complete. It was definitely more challenging to make the paint adhere to the crackle paste, but I'm not giving up on crackle paste just yet. I do think it can have applications with watercolors. The solution may just be to apply a light coat of watercolor ground over the top before adding my colors. Well, that's it, sweet friends. Thank you again so much for joining me on my creative journey. I hope you enjoyed this week's video, and most of all, I hope you have a wonderful week. And don't forget, happy creating!